Guardian reported today that Utah has banned statewide in all public libraries books by several authors, including Judy Blume and Sarah Maas. 13 books in total. Six of the authors are women. They are to be removed from all public school, classroom, and libraries for, quote, objective, sensitive materials. It's funny and interesting that 50 years after Judy Blume came on the scene with Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret, which scandalized people at the time for talking about menstruation. Judy Blume is still being banned in public libraries. The irony, of course, is that if you just look at a book like the Bible, it is full of, quote, objective, sensitive materials, a lot of which, frankly, when I was a kid, kind of freaked me out. So let's go through a few of the examples. Genesis chapter 40, this is where Joseph has is interpreting dreams, and both the baker has a dream, and he goes and requests, and as well as the cupbearer, an interpretation of the dream. And with respect to the baker, he has this bread he's carrying, and then the birds come and steal the bread from him, and he asks Joseph to interpret the dream. And Joseph says, within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift your head and impale your body on a pole, and the birds will eat away your flesh. And then the text goes on and says that's what happened. He was impaled, the chief baker, just as Joseph had interpreted in the dream. That image stayed with me as a kid for years. This idea of a decapitated corpse, head lying in the dirt, and then ravens and buzzards coming and picking at the flesh of the corpse. I would say that's objective sensitive material. Judges chapter 3 describes an assassination, which includes stabbing and defecation. Beginning in verse 26, Ehud approached King Eglon while he was sitting in the upper room of the palace and said, I have a message from God for you. As the king rose from his seat, Ehud reached out in his left hand, drew his sword from his right thigh, and plunged it into the king's belly. Even the handle sank in after the blade and his bowels discharged. Ehud did not pull the sword out, and the fat closed in over it. That's this image. That horrified and grossed me out as a kid. I remember reading that. I'd say that's objective sensitive material right there. Numbers 25. So this is the description about a man and a woman, one Israelite, one Midianite, having sexual relations. And Phineas becomes so enraged by this, he enters the tent, takes a spear, and, quote, he followed the Israelite into the tent. He drove the spear into both of them, right through the Israelite man and into the woman's stomach. The image you kind of get is that they're actually in some kind of coital interaction, and they are both impaled by a spear like a shish kebab. And then the plague against the Israelites was stopped. The implication being, it appears, that the divine wrath was placated or satisfied against the Israelites because Phineas, in his zeal, impaled this man and this woman with a spear. Again, that was a shocking image. And I always had that image of a shish kebab. For years, every time I would take this little rail from a shish kebab and just slide meat onto it to cook it, I would always this image from this definitely objective sensitive material there. Judges chapter 19, this group demands that this man be sent out so he can be gang raped, and the man who is hosting him refuses to do that, but instead he sends his one of his concubines out, and it says the man took his concubine, sent her outside to them, and they raped her and abused her through the night, and at dawn they let her go. At daybreak, the woman came back to the house where her master was staying, fell down at the door, and lay there until daylight. It's such a shocking, horrifying image that this woman had been gang raped, brutalized in untold, unimaginable ways one can hardly imagine. And then she lies there and she dies. And what does the man do then? Uh, he takes out a knife and he dismembers her body, cuts it into 12 pieces, and sends it off to different parts of the land of Israel. Is there something more shocking and objective than that in Sarah Mass and Judy Blume. One more example. Ezekiel 23. Now, this is where Ezekiel the prophet is describing the people of Israel as two different unfaithful sisters, using graphic sexual imagery and violent imagery to convey the unfaithfulness of Israel, the people of Israel, and God's wrath against them. Then she became more and more promiscuous as she recalled the days of her youth when she was a prostitute in Egypt. There she lusted after her lovers, whose genitals were like those of donkeys and whose emissions were like those of horses. So you long for the lewdness of your youth, when in Egypt your bosom was caressed and your young breasts fondled. I would say this is definitely objective, sensitive material here. Uh, and there is an overlay of patriarchy and, frankly, misogyny in so much of the content that we've just looked at, as well as xenophobia, like in the interactions of the Israelites and the Midianites. It's a very shocking world, but the text is full of objective, sensitive material. So he or she who lives by the book ban dies by the book ban. And if you want to argue that in our conservative society or whatever, we're going to ban this list of books because we find it to be objective, sensitive material. Well, you better be prepared for a future state, a future situation in which other people happen to find a list of other books be offensive, having offensive, sensitive material. And based upon the precedent you've created, they can now be warranted in banning all those books, including perhaps the Bible. So, suffice it to say, I think it is a huge mistake to go around banning books, even if you don't like the book, even if some of the content is offensive, because I'm going to say time and again, we find the cure is worse than the disease. And the banning of books is worse than the books themselves. And frankly, all it really does is put a spotlight on the very books that you want to ban and makes people want to read them more. One last thing is I also think we need to get beyond this idea that somehow we overlook and ignore graphic content within the Bible because it's in the Bible. We think that somehow that doesn't impact kids, that it is all somehow age appropriate. I mean, I got my first Bible when I was uh, 6 years old. My second Bible, my full Bible, the first was a New Testament. The second one was a full Bible. It was maybe about a year later, so 6 or 7 years old. And it was, of course, had all this content in it. Now, the small mercy is I didn't read a lot of this stuff until later, but even when you're reading it at 8 or 9 years old, 10 years old, that's pretty shocking. And of course, what I just talked about is just the tip of the iceberg. The most overt example of this idea that somehow if it's in the Bible, it's okay for everyone came when I went to see The Passion of the Christ in theaters 20 years ago. And a man and his wife brought their two small children, like 5 years old, 6 years old, into the film. I couldn't believe the theater even allowed that. This was rated, I think, an NC-17 film in several jurisdictions for its graphic violence. 2 hours of a man being graphically tortured to death. And I told this father, "What are you doing? This is not appropriate for your child." He was not, English was not his main language, and I'm not sure how much he understood of me, but he really kind of just blew me off. Um, and for 2 hours, I was traumatized, frankly, by listening to this child crying beside me, because that was frankly just over child abuse. To bring a child in to watch that film, that was not appropriate for any child to view. Just because it's relaying or narrating a story from the Bible doesn't automatically make it appropriate content, because the Bible has a lot of this content. So to conclude, not only should we be challenging the hypocrisy and double standards of people who selectively ban books because they find them to be offensive, but you should put a serious spotlight on content in the Bible and other religious texts to say just because these happen to be in a text that is revered as holy or inspired within a particular community, that doesn't make this content all in this text appropriate for children.